Hello and welcome. This is a public affairs forum sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. My name is Luther Elmore. These forums are held on Sundays, the second and third Sundays of the month, in an effort to further the ends of this church, to nourish the mind and spirit, to serve social justice, and to inform and inspire. We've been conducting these public affairs forums since the church was first incorporated in 1954. And as far as we know, it is the longest continuously operating public forum in the state of Texas. For information about these forums, you can go to our church website, austinuu.org. Today we're very happy to welcome from this congregation 6 writers. We are a congregation of about 600 members. This congregation has many creative, innovative, and intelligent people, musicians, photographers, graphic artists, and writers. So we welcome these 6 here today to talk about their recent works. We welcome Meg Barnhouse, our senior minister, who will speak about her book, Broken Buddha. These are ordinary stories of life that bring laughter, tears, and/or both. We also welcome Klondike Steadman. Klondike is an extraordinary musician and teacher. His recent book is Loving Practice, Developing Discipline, a Parent's Guide to Turning Music Lessons into Life Lessons. If that is not definition enough, that book tells those how to turn music practice into joyful activity, which teaches life skills. We also have Catherine Perkins, a prolific writer who is fairly new to the congregation, who will be telling us about her book, You're Not a Real Goth Until You Sack Rome. So in the world of goth, when are you authentic? We also have Chris Barton, a well-known and respected writer of children's books. Chris will be talking about his new book, What Do You Do with a Voice Like That? The story of extraordinary Congressman Barbara Jordan, described as a story of this Texas hero, beautifully illustrated by Eku Holmes. We also have Ernie Wood, a talented and creative writer who's written a time-traveling book, One Red Thread. Time traveling into family history, back to the present, and current problems. And lastly, we have a former university professor of history, Phil Hewitt, telling us about his new recent mystery, Revenge of the Eagle, a Lee Phillips thriller, tracking us through Texas. As he describes it, a non-action book from Veracruz to Big Bend to the battleship Texas. We welcome them all and look forward to their presentations. If you would welcome them, and would first welcome Meg to the podium.
Thank you, Luther. My name is Meg Barnhouse, and I'm going to read from one of my books, but I have 6. And if anybody on the radio or TV would like to find my books, just Google Barnhouse, like a barn and a house, and you'll find all my grandfather's books. But they're all about the books of John and Romans, and if you love his books, you will hate mine. I'm going to read a story from the Radio Free Bubba, the best of Radio Free Bubba, which was my NPR commentary. It's called Meg's Bible Control Bill. I start to rant and rave when I read about yet another fundamentalist group punishing their children harshly, yelling prayers and Bible verses for hours at people who are tied to chairs, asking members to sign over all their worldly goods to the church, scaring folks to death with stories of hell and demons and the end of the world. I wonder why they always use those 2 or 3 verses from Proverbs that encourage hitting people with the rod. Why don't they ever read the one that tells fathers not to provoke their children to smoldering anger? Call me crazy, but it seems to me that a child who was beaten while verses were shouted at her might develop a hint of anger later in life. Why do they harp so much on the verse about women submitting to their husbands, and they never quote the verse that comes right before it that says, submit yourselves one to another? Well, you see, now I'm doing it too. I was raised by Bible-quoting people. Because of that, I know the Bible well. Because of that, I don't like to read it much. I heard a preacher's wife at a youth conference speak to an audience of 200 college women. Girls, she began in a husky and confidential tone, you know how much power we have over men. I looked at my students sitting next to me, and they looked at me with raised eyebrows. Apparently, none of us had felt particularly powerful in that way. You know that we can tempt them to sin without even trying. You remember in Genesis when Eve tempted Adam to eat the apple, and he said, "No, I can't eat that. God told us not to eat of that fruit." And then the preacher's wife, mimicking Eve, said, "Honey, if you want to sleep with me tonight, you'll eat some of the apple." I swear the woman shimmied her shoulders and bent over to show cleavage when she said, "Honey." I was clutching the edge of my chair with white knuckles, horrified. If you read the actual story in the actual book, it says only this: "And she turned to Adam and gave it to him, and he ate." Where are the womanly wiles? Where's Eve, the temptress? I am furious that so much of what women have had to deal with in this world comes from a stupid misinterpretation of this one story. Later on, Paul the Apostle says that man is superior to woman because he was made first and she was made second. I'm a logical person, and it seems to me that logically, if you're going to read the story for who is superior to whom, you would see that it was the plants that were made first, and then the stars and the planets and the birds and the fish and the animals, and last, Adam. If the ones made first are the ones who should be in charge, then we should all be taking orders from the ficus tree in the front window or from the goldfish in the kids' room. Some people I know use the Bible like a weapon, shooting verses back and forth at each other, mowing down opinions and assertions in the battle of beliefs. And don't even get me started on the folks who use the book of Revelation to fuel their madness, obsessing for endless years about who Gog and Magog are and who the Antichrist is and when the end is going to come. Now, no one rants and raves from the kindest and most liberal part of themselves, and I am no exception. When I get particularly discouraged, I'm likely to think along these lines. Because over-rigid and undereducated interpretations of the Bible affect the lives of so many, especially women and children, by encouraging violence and oppression, I propose we have some sort of safeguards concerning who can own and operate a Bible. We have gun control now, such as it is, and my Bible control bill borrows heavily from that legislation. I'm thinking of a 3-day waiting period before you can purchase a Bible, so the store can run background checks to make sure you have no prior convictions of child abuse. In that way, we reduce the odds of people thumping on a Bible while they thump on a child. And you should have to sign a paper like you do when you get married, where you swear that you're not insane, because insanity and the book of Revelation are a bad combination. Most of all, in order to purchase a Bible, you must have started at least 3 sentences in the past year with the words, "I could be wrong." I'll give all of this some more thought. I would welcome suggestions, and you know I'm ranting and raving now, so I could be wrong.
My name's Klondike Steadman, and I wrote this book, Loving Practice, Developing Discipline, not because I'm an aspiring writer or I enjoy writing. Actually, it was literally the most painful thing I've ever done in my life. But because when people find out that I'm a music teacher and that I own a music school, if they have children, I invariably get assailed with questions immediately about how can I possibly get my child to practice? They hate practicing. I thought it was going to be a wonderful experience because they, like my own daughter, their children, like my own daughter, came to them at a young age begging to take music lessons, and they thought this is going to be such a beautiful, wonderful, enriching experience for them. And so it should be, because music lessons should provide us the opportunity to move forward into a skill that will help us express our deepest longings, help us connect with other people, help us to develop our own focus and passion, help us to express the joy of getting married and the sorrow of losing someone close to us. And it truly can. It saved my life. I came from a very, very difficult background, childhood, and getting my father's guitar when I turned 10, He had died in a car accident when I was 5. Getting his guitar really and truly gave me something that I could pour my life into, and in many ways saved my life. Unfortunately, the experience most kids have is one of being sent to a lesson in which you're given arcane rules about how you should and shouldn't engage with this instrument, and then told to do that every day for at least 45 minutes, whether or not you have any idea how that could have anything to do with your life. So over the years, I have helped some of my students. I've learned from my wonderful wife how she's helped her students. And I think that we've created an environment in which many, many children love to play their instruments. It's still difficult. It's difficult to get good at anything. But I think there is a way in which they find a truth and a joy and a passion for it that can motivate them to develop the skills that then allow them to be expressive. To illustrate this, I'd like to read a little bit about one of my students, Ishan, who actually just this last week gave another public concert of just astounding beauty and creativity, performing a piece he'd composed, and a bunch of made variations of other people's music, and played a duet with one of his best friends. I wrote this over a year ago, so everything's a little outdated, but I said, over the past 3 years, Ishan has learned over 100 folk songs. Oh, and by the way, he started at age 4. And popular classical melodies through which he has mastered the basic techniques of guitar, come to understand the underpinnings of melody and rhythm, and deepened his love of music. He has shown particular interest in improvisation and composition, so whenever we get a new concept, I play improvisation games with him, and he often comes back to the lesson with new compositions he has created. At the end of his 2nd year, he performed a home concert. That is a concert in his home for his friends and neighbors and family, even some coming from halfway across the country. His focus throughout the concert and his delight when it was over was something I'll always cherish witnessing. His parents reported that he wouldn't set his guitar down for the entire weekend after the concert. The following year, he made a CD of his favorite songs, and the year after that, he traveled with a number of our students to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City, both solo and as part of a large ensemble. For each of these goals, he had to stretch his abilities both physically and mentally, often undertaking practicing twice a day for periods of months leading up to the goal. Along the way, he used his recitals to raise money for supporting food pantries at low-income schools in Austin and education programs for kids in rural India. He also raised funds to support an organization called Heart Gift that provides life-saving heart surgeries to underprivileged kids from around the world with congenital heart defects, much like the surgery he himself received when he was an infant to mend the hole in his heart. He performs regularly at his school, especially when he can play a piece of music that exemplifies the topic being taught, such as when he played and sang the song Los Pollitos in his Spanish class. Ishan's abilities now are those of an exceptional and well-rounded musician. He has solid technical ability. He can learn many pieces in many styles. He has a solid musical ability and can learn by ear, read music, improvise, and come up with lovely compositions on the spot. He's by no means a musical prodigy, but I have no doubt that if he maintains his current level of progress, he will achieve the level of mastery associated with concert musicians sometime, probably in his late teens or early 20s. This doesn't mean that I will be disappointed if he doesn't become a professional concert musician. It simply means that he will have the ability to express himself at that level of artistry. Furthermore, and more importantly in my opinion, he will have learned the disciplined behaviors that lead to the highest levels of expertise, which will therefore allow him to achieve the same level of success at anything to which he sets his mind. Without a doubt, Ishan started with an exceptional interest in music that continues to this day. When I play music for him in the lesson, my own music, his eyes go wide with wonder, and he often makes the most astounding observations about the beauty of music. Nevertheless, in most respects, he's a regular boy like any other I've taught. He's often distracted, tired, and unfocused in the lesson. If given the chance, he will talk without pause for the entire lesson. His parents both work, so he doesn't get home until after 6 p.m. each day, and must do homework, eat, play, and get to bed in a few short hours, leaving little time for practice. Actually, because he's practicing more, his parents recently made an adjustment to his schedule, so that there will be someone to pick him up right after school so he can get home to practice. But that's kind of the point, is that when there's something in our lives that we find so attractive, so meaningful, we're willing to make significant changes to our plans, to our life structure, and look at our schedule. I teach parents when I give workshops on this topic that just having the passion for something is not nearly enough to lead you to do it on a regular basis. Life will get in the way. If you have a child who wants to play piano, but that child is never near a piano, it is unlikely they will learn to do so. So I think that the process of following a passion is one of finding all the little things that can make you be more disciplined and engage more effectively to develop the skill that can lead you to be joyful in your entire life. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Catherine Perkins. I write young adult speculative fiction, mostly fantasy. Lots of fairy princesses with ADHD, disabled pixies with their service crows, that sort of thing. My most recent series begins with the book You're Not a Real Goth Until You Sack Rome, which is actually historical fantasy. Still young adult, but it's historical because it's set in the 1990s. So for all you parents out there, that's historical fiction now. And You're Not a Real Goth Until You Sack Rome explores the witchcraft folklore of continental Europe through the eyes of a Seattle teenager named Perdita Raven Schwartz. She goes by Ray because although she is very much a goth, she doesn't want to sound like she's trying too hard. And so I wanted to simply read the first page of You're Not a Real Goth Until You Sack Rome, because before she's uncovering dark family secrets or swept into mystic adventures in folkloric realms or any of that, Ray has an even more serious problem: high school. So chapter 1 is entitled People Are Strange. In moments like this one, Ray often thought to herself, what would Morticia Adams do? And unfortunately, the answer was always the same. Not sure, but she'd do it with grace, poise, and style. Probably before it got to this point. Freak, said Becky as she shoved Ray back against the locker. Ray was vaguely glad that her hoodie cushioned that slightly and kept any rough metallic edges from snagging the black lace on her shirt. Becky was not a cheerleader. Ray couldn't recall the last time a cheerleader even made eye contact. Becky was instead the sort of person who would want to be a cheerleader and then be surprised not to make the cut. Few people were quite the same sort of dangerous, Ray figured, as those who'd always gotten everything they ever wanted when suddenly they didn't. Because those left out of their assumed place in the pecking order then tended to begin proving to themselves and their friends that there were still some people they were better than. Thank you, and the sequel is also out, as is the closer to the series, Midnight or Something Darker, but I don't have a copy of that one yet. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chris Barton, and my books for children include both seriously researched nonfiction and completely ridiculous fiction. I enjoyed them doing equally. I would not have nearly as much fun as an author of children's books if I had to choose one or the other. Today, I'm going to talk about my most recent nonfiction book, What Do You Do with a Voice Like That? The Story of Extraordinary Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, which was illustrated by an artist from Boston, Massachusetts, named Aqua Holmes. So first, could just raise your hand if you are familiar with Barbara Jordan? and raise your hand if you're not familiar with Barbara Jordan. That's more or less the breakdown I would expect from this group. It's not always that case, but when I began working on this book in 2013, and during the 5 years that it was in development, when I would tell Texans, generally of a certain vintage, that I was writing a picture book biography of Barbara Jordan, I would get one of three reactions. Oh, I miss her. Oh, we need her. Oh, that voice. And it made me more determined than ever to tell the story of how that great voice came to be and what she did with it. So I would like to read the first several pages of What Do You Do with a Voice Like That, written by me, illustrated by Aqua Holmes. Growing up in the 5th Ward of Houston, Texas, Barbara Jordan stood out. She may have looked like other kids. She may have acted like other kids, but she sure didn't sound like other kids, not with that voice of hers. That voice, that big, bold, booming, crisp, clear, confident voice, it caused folks to sit right up, stand up straight, and take notice. What do you do with a voice like that? Well, first you give that voice something to say. Barbara recited poetry at church. She memorized speeches for school. She entered oratory contests, and in 1952 won a trip to Chicago, the first time she'd ever left Texas. Barbara was proud of herself and proud of her voice. It was laying a path for her, but where would that path lead? On Sunday evenings, Barbara would talk things over with Grandpa Patton. Would she become a preacher like her father and like her mother could have been, or a teacher like those who encouraged her at Phyllis Wheatley High? Or perhaps she'd become a lawyer. Not many black women had achieved that, but one who had done so visited Wheatley and gave a stirring speech. Barbara was inspired. Being a lawyer would be a marvelous use of her voice. But before that can happen, what's the next thing you do with a voice like that? You give it more knowledge to work with. College opened Barbara's eyes to how the country was changing and how it wasn't. She learned how to find facts for herself, debate important issues, defend good ideas, and dismantle bad ones. Her law classes challenged her more than anything she'd known. She hid her struggles from her classmates, studying long and hard and out of sight. And when she graduated, yes, Barbara became a lawyer, but being a lawyer bored her. She used a typewriter and pen a lot more than she did her voice, and there was not enough work to occupy her time or her mind. There was, however, lots of political work that needed doing. In 1960, America was not as free or as fair a place as it could be. Barbara believed that politics could change that, so she got involved. One night, a scheduled speaker was absent, and Barbara was asked if she would fill in. She said yes. The audience loved her. They trusted her. Most important, they were inspired to do something, to get out and vote, and to help round up others and get them to vote. Her voice had made a difference. Barbara, bitten by the political bug, as she later put it, knew just what to do with a voice like that. And the story continues on. It goes into her election to the Texas State Senate, and then to her election to the U.S. Congress. And in a accomplishment of timeliness I could not have envisioned back when I started writing this in 2013, it addresses her role in the Watergate hearings. Soon came a troubled, confusing time for the nation. President Nixon, it seemed, had broken the law, and Congress had to decide what to do about it. On a TV broadcast seen throughout the country, Barbara used her voice to show them the way. She reminded her audience that the Constitution is the document governing all the laws in the United States and applies to all of its people. Then she explained, in her big, bold, booming, crisp, clear, confident tone, how the president's actions had gone against that document. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. The Constitution, Barbara said, must be preserved. The president, Barbara said, must go. The president went. Thank you.
My name is Ernie Wood, and my novel, One Red Thread, came out next month. It will have been 5 years, which is hard to believe. I'll see if I can remember what it was all about. Like a lot of people, I can remember, though, things that happened a long time ago, sometimes better than what's recently. So thinking about when I was in college, a very small college in upstate New York, we had a writer in residence who was to become very famous. He wrote a book using the techniques of fiction to tell a true story. The author was Alex Haley, and his book was Roots. Problem is, I didn't take his course. I was in some seminars for English majors that he gave, and so I did have some dealings with him, but I took the advanced nonfiction course instead. I was, at the time, really more interested in writing nonfiction than fiction, which led me into newspapers, and then to magazines, and then to journalism. So what I want to talk, and along the way, I either wrote or co-wrote 10 nonfiction books, along with quite a few scripts for documentary films. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is the transition from writing nonfiction to writing fiction. When I started thinking about writing a novel, it seemed like a great thing to do because I had a day job and I was writing 8 hours a day for an advertising agency. And if I was to write nonfiction, I wouldn't have to do much research, and I wouldn't have to do any traveling, and I could just make it all up. Shows what I knew. It doesn't quite work that way. So where to begin? When I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell the story about her brother, who in the late 1890s was I think he was 8 or 9 years old at the time, and he had a part-time job sweeping up and cleaning up in a general store. And one day, some of the men that worked in the store gave him a ticket to a public hanging. You needed a ticket because it was actually inside the prison. Anybody could go if you had a ticket, but that made it public that it was open. It was the last hanging in that county in eastern North Carolina. He went, he came home, he went in his room and shut the door and didn't come out for about 3 days. And I always thought, if I ever write a novel, this will be a great way to, something to include, something a good place to begin. And so I started thinking about that as a starting point. Coincidentally, I was here in this church in a book group that was reading a lot of Eastern spirituality. We were reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching. We read a contemporary book called The Tao of Physics, which related the teachings of Eastern religion to quantum physics, which was actually fascinating and really wonderful. So I started thinking a lot about karma, cause and effect, which begat some ideas for how to structure the book about this. Because when you think about karma, most people think about things that you personally did that will have an effect. And I started thinking about what happens about the things your parents did, what happens about the things your grandparents did, what is the effect on your life of them, and came to this story about my great uncle and was thinking that that could be something that then rippled forward in time and had an effect on the characters of a novel. I started thinking that if this effect was still out there, it could be somewhat like when you look at a star at night, you're looking back in time. You're looking at light that left that star tens, hundreds, thousands of years ago. Takes that long to get here. Well, what if there were other forces on Earth, sounds, movement of wind, other sorts of forces that might still be out there. And if you could access them, maybe you could access the event in the past. I want to read a couple of paragraphs, just less than half a page, on this that sort of talks about this and gives an idea of what the book is like. The scene takes place early in the morning when the main character named Eddie and his wife Sheila are just waking up, and their cat Ike is there. Look at him, speaking of Ike, looking at him, I said, nodding at Ike, who was sitting up straight now, a porcelain cat, symmetrical with eyes like saucers. His face rotated around in counterclockwise circles. I don't know what he's seeing, but he's seeing something, some tiny little bug. Sheila sat up, swatted at the air, and fell back on her pillow. Ike looked around confused. Nothing to watch now. He rolled over, and Sheila began scratching his belly. No bug, she announced. There's something out there, I said, opening another window. I looked down at the gutter edging the porch roof below. You know how the air is always clearing after a storm, and everything smells different? How there are smells, sounds and smells, and there's a light breeze you usually don't notice? It didn't rain last night, Sheila said. She ran her fingers the length of the cat's tail. I stood and crossed to the last closed window of the room. Raising the sash, I could feel a slight breeze, barely enough to move the curtains, but definitely there. Let's leave all the windows open, I said. Let's see what happens. What happens, said Sheila, is the house gets hot. It's August. So what about people? If you've got the concept of these forces that might come through karma from the past, and you've got the basic idea of an event in the past that may solve this, you need something about the people. To write a novel, what you really need is conflict of some sort. You get a little bit of that in here between Eddie and Sheila. They're disagreeing already, even in the very early pages. In the course of writing this, I had read 35 time travel novels. Almost none of them approach what happens when you return to the present. And of course, when you go and you learn things that nobody else in your family knows, especially things that people may be wanting to keep secrets, that causes a lot of conflict. I went to the Austin History Center, did a lot of research in microfilm there about contemporary accounts of public hangings in Texas, and used that. So I ended up doing a fair amount of research, and then I ended up doing a lot of sort of mining my own history and my own thoughts, family history. And just like in writing nonfiction, once you get a lot of these ideas together, it begins to tell you what it needs to be. I did at one point take all my ideas, put them on index cards, and put them on the dining room table and shuffle them around, but not too much. The result, the American Statesman back in the days when the Statesman used to actually write reviews, said that Wood has an easy style and now knows how to unravel a complicated tale that keeps your interest. More importantly, my former writing professor in college, the one I took the nonfiction course from, said, the work has taken me back to my own life story, all the way back to a photo of my 6th birthday party that shows some faces without names that I almost remember as well as my deceased younger sister and my inseparable best friend, my best friend King. Oh yes, I like Ike. The cat is a major character and an ingenious unifying element. We never get inside his head, of course, but we can never know what cats are thinking. Thank you.
I'm Phil Hewitt. I'm going to talk about 2 books while Luther passes out something for me now, please. How many of you have been to Big Bend country out west? Wow, cool. Go again. For the last 10 years of my professional career, I was the Director of Interpretive Services at Texas Parks and Wildlife. And part of my staff, about 15 or 20 of them, were involved in developing the programmatic aspects of Big Bend Ranch State Park. It's about 330,000 acres. It's just to the east of the national park, which is over 800,000 acres. And so I've been fortunate enough in my life to travel to Big Bend and Big Bend National Park probably around 70, 75 times. And every time I go, I am amazed, enthralled, humbled, fascinated, intrigued by the majesty of the country. Some of you may have heard of a country western song, the line of which somewhere is, "I've seen sunsets that'll make you cry." Yep, it's there. Just when you think the great spirit of the universe or God or your higher power has created every color of orange, red, yellow, blue, gray, black, mauve that you've ever heard of, boink, it happens again. I think you could go every day and be amazed, every day. So, one night, a long time ago, when I was still working, I was reading a piece of fiction. I was on a retreat, the training retreat with Parks and Wildlife, and it was horrible, the book was. So I bounced it off the corner of the motel room and said to myself, I can write better than this. So in 2 days, I wrote 60 pages of Mariscal Canyon Dead, for those of you who are here, not out there in Radio Land. And I didn't do anything with it for a year and a half, and I met an agent at the Texas Writers League Agents and Authors Conference, and this was in July. She said, "So did you bring a copy of the manuscript?" Well, if you know how it is, authors will lie to you, sell their grandmother into white slavery for 2 more days. That was in July. I went home, wrote 2 hours a night, took it to her in October, and I learned 2 things. One is never take a book set in Big Bend country to an agent who lives in Sag Harbor, New York. So, I'm going to do a couple of readings here, very, very, very brief. Mariscal Canyon is, for those of you who, all of you have been, is the most remote canyon in the national park. 5 bodies lay sprawled in the chalk dust around a campfire circle in those awkward, vaguely obscene positions the suddenly dead assume. Blood splattered everywhere. The desert dust and the walls of the little side canyon were peppered with it. The turkey vultures didn't even move when I rounded the canyon wall. Bits of flesh hung from more than 20 beaks. They had no interest in sharing. Beat it, scram, go, didn't work. I fired 3 rounds from the .45 auto I carried. I nailed 3 of them that were snacking off of the good stuff. Eyeballs, cheek meat, forearms, fingers, and hands. Life is tough, even for vultures in this rough, high desert South Big Bend country. There's enough protein in this small box canyon for several days fine dining. Must be losing my touch, though. Time was when I'd have got at least 4. The horses, Pepper, my small white Mustang gelding with black specks, and Star, my brown mare pack horse, didn't want anything to do with all that blood and strange smells. Neither did Rusty, my Irish setter-colored German Shepherd hearing dog. So, intro paragraph is designed to do a couple of things. One is give you some acquaintance to what you've gotten yourself in for. The other is to introduce a couple of the characters. The book series are all set in Big Bend or Big Bend country or the Texas coast or the Gulf of Mexico. There are 4 main characters, 4 human characters. One is Lee Phillips, the protagonist in the title, whose name is actually that of an uncle of mine who died as an infant in 1910. He is an academic adventurer, historian on staff at UT. He's deaf, so he has a hearing dog. As far as I know, I've never been able to find an actual German Shepherd-colored German Shepherd, Irish setter-colored German Shepherd. Got it? All right. The more you practice it, the worse he comes out. So the other 3 primary characters in the book. One is Lee's wife, Lisa DeMarco, who is has her own therapy business in Austin, Texas. She and he are partners in these great adventures. The second one is a 6'3" woman named Charlie Burnside, who speaks and reads 8 different languages, can do research and at least that many, and possibly more, and plays a blues guitar that is good enough to do about anything you want. And the third human one is a woman named Susan Steele, who is a high-powered attorney from New Orleans and a longtime friend of Lisa and Lee. The thing that I intentionally wanted to do was do a book that involved, and then there's Rusty, who is critical to the story because Lee doesn't hear. His hearing is worse than mine, which is pretty pathetic. So you have 4 people who are involved, and then one dog, plus the other primary things going on here is the scenery, the majesty, and the grandeur of Big Bend, the Big Bend country. That considered it as another character. And then in Revenge of the Eagle, which is set in Big Bend, Texas Gulf Coast, Gulf of Mexico, and Mexico, is the other major part of the book, of the series. There'll be 5 altogether. Revenge of the Eagle is number 2. Its origin is a little different from the others. I wrote it I actually outlined this book on a, if any of you ever been to Rockport, Texas, there's some seafood steaming places down there that have butcher paper on the tables. So I had a crayon, or several crayons, and I started writing it between the first and the third glass of wine back when I was drinking. By the third glass of wine, it didn't sound too good. But I took it home, and then out of all that comes Revenge of the Eagle. I'll read a short piece and then close. This is when Lee and Lisa have been arrested and thrown in a Mexican jail in Tuxpan, Mexico. The worst sound you're ever likely to hear is the clang of a jail cell door shutting. A steel door locking has that uncomfortable sound of permanence. With that, you know your life is no longer your own. The Tuxpan lockup is about like most others in the world. The thing you remember most are the smells. Unwashed men's bodies, stale men's sweat. There's no deodorant in jail. And the collective odors of urine, dirt, and if you're lucky, that sharp, pungent smell of floor cleaning fluid and bug spray. But even those aren't the worst things. Those are the blank, cowed faces of prisoners with vacant stares, all with the overlying stink of humiliation, degradation, and hopelessness. So Lisa and I were busted. Less an issue for me than for her. They strip searched and cavity searched both of us, the full treatment. The guards issued white jumpsuits, maybe cleaner looking, but still prison jumpsuits. We weren't allowed to stay together. The cells were not even in the same along the same corridor. I hoped we could get that changed in a day or two. So, the blurbs on this work pretty well, and I hope that all of you enjoy the book when you get it either online or from me. So, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Lucas.
Thank you.
This is for writers of fiction. How do you decide on the names for your characters?
You want to go first?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
How do you decide, writers of fiction, how do you decide on the names of your character? I think you shared with one of yours, your uncle. So how do you
bet.
decide on those names?
You bet. The first character, Lee Phillips, is from a real person. His name was Harry Lee Phillips. And Phillips being my mother's maiden name. Susan Steele is from a friend of mine who lived in New Orleans. She was not a lawyer. She was a librarian, and that was not her real name. It was partly that. Charlie is taken from my next door neighbor when I lived in San Antonio, but it was a he there. And his name was David, and David was, he could read and write and translate Renaissance Spanish and 2 or 3 other languages like that. And then some of the other characters, you just want to come up with something that is fits the character you want. You do not want characters with long, complex names because, one, you forget them, and two, one of the things you have to remember is if Susan Steele is a petite, very white woman with very black hair on page X, she better be that same thing on page 3X, because people will know. So,
Catherine?
I had a lot of fun naming characters. The three heroines of this book are Perdita Raven Schwartz, she goes by by Ray. Henrietta Sunshine Little Thunder, she goes by Henny. Her middle name was particularly fun, both because it reflects the character who's very cheerful, but the reason is that her dad was trying to come up with a way to name a daughter after Sonny Six Killer. And so that's what I and my writing collaborators have always done, is to think about the character's background, their living situation, what would their parents have named them, you know? And the third heroine is Erica, Diego's daughter Anderson, who is very Viking, yes, even though her father's name is Diego. And it's was a particularly fun one to have the names reflecting their cultural heritage and what they take pride in. So that's my answer.
Another question? Oh, it's Ernie.
Yeah. So one character I just picked out of the phone book. Back in the days when we had phone books, I just started looking around and seeing a name that sounded right. But the main character of the book is a guy named Eddie McBride. And it's sort of Dickensian, really, the way, if you recall Dickens, all the names sort of meant something, or they sounded like they meant something. Eddie is spelled E-D-D-Y, not the usual E-D-D-I-E spelling. I got the idea one day after swimming at Deep Eddy. Seriously, because as Eddie starts going back in time, he starts sort of spiraling down and getting in more and more trouble as he goes. McBride is because to him, even though he messes things up, his relationship with his wife, his marriage, is really the most important thing to him. So I thought the name McBride, the word bride in it, would have some meaning too. That, of course, again, in the passage I read, they're having an argument at the very beginning of the book, and they argue all the way through about things, because he wanted to. He stumbled into this time traveling business. She's begging him not to do it. One of the other characters is begging him to teach her how to do it, and the third one, the guy whose name came out of the phone book, is a guy who's drinking so it wouldn't happen to him by mistake. So.
You may remain seated.
Thank you. I'm Michael West. My question is about Barbara Jordan to the author. And the real question is, what an incredibly powerful figure from the last century. Are there any current candidates for future books that you think could command that kind of presence and actually offer a few words to the children of today?
So candidate for future books that is comparable to Barbara Jordan. I'm not sure there's another human period that's comparable to Barbara Jordan. There is somebody that I have a book in the works about right now who I think is inspiring to me in a different way, and I think can speak to young people today in a different way. He's not a well-known public figure. He is still living, but he's someone whose background tied together participating in the very early activities of the space program. And so sort of giving his body, really sacrificing his body in some ways for the betterment of his country, and then getting involved in the civil rights movement and sacrificing his body in other ways, and still remaining all these decades later, still very much, a believer in the potential of the United States, and more hopeful, certainly far more hopeful than bitter. And so it's a different type of story, but And I do think that the people I'm typically drawn to write about are people who I think have something, there's something inspiring about them, something motivating about them. If I'm going to spend, in this case it was 5 years researching, writing Barbara Jordan's story and getting it published, I have to really like that person and want to spend 5 years with them. Thank you.
Ron?
Oh, I wonder when you have an idea for a book, do you end up starting with the end of the book, what you want to accomplish, and then develop how you're going to get there? How much does it change as you start writing the book from the beginning to the end? How do your ideas change so much, if at all?
I read an interview a while back with John Irving, who wrote Cider House Rules and some other books, and he said he always writes to the end first. I didn't. I never wrote a complete outline. I had an outline that stretched about 3 chapters ahead of where I was. So I knew where the immediate story was going, but I didn't know where the whole thing was going until it happened. So once you create the characters, they sort of tell you what's going to happen. And once you sort of set the structure for the thing. I mean, I had a character that halfway through I realized, I can't tell you because it's a spoiler, but something bad has to happen to this person. And I didn't have any choice. I had to write it that way because that's the way the personality of the character was.
Anyone else want to share answer that? Okay. Philip and then Catherine.
So there are, if you're interested in writing a novel, there are a couple of things, 3 books I recommend. One is called, if you're a mystery writer, you too can write a mystery. Yeah, well, maybe. The other one is 20 Master Plots. Then the last one I recommend that worked really well for me is a book by a guy named, oddly enough, John Smith, called The Writer's Little Helper, honest to goodness. And he recommends, don't bother writing outlines because you're going to change it anyway, and you do. I probably came up with, originally had 3 very different endings for Revenge of the Eagle, and threw them all out as I was going. And part of it happens for me as the novel progresses. Some of that becomes sort of self-fulfilling, and it kind of leads you and the reader to a logical end. If it doesn't, the readers figure it out before you do. So don't write, outlines don't work for me, but a lot of people do use them. So there you are.
I always outline. My collaborator and I would discuss the idea, the characters, voice test at length, and then carefully hammer out a chapter-by-chapter outline. And that is the outline until it isn't. And then we make another outline. So it's a sort of combination of what they call planning and pantsing, which is flying by the seat of your pants. And but I always like to have some parts scattered out of, like, I'll write chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 10, and chapter 30, and then I'll write the ones in between, because that's just the way my scatterbrained mind works. But I do like to have a sense of the end before I really put pencil to the middle.
I think we have time for one more short question.
My name is Nancy Bellows, and I have 2 real quick things. It's not actually a question. I made the book Outdoors Austin happen. I was the editor, and I would be interested in feedback if you know that book. But more importantly, I would like to suggest that you that did the book about Barbara Jordan might consider doing a book about John Goodenough, who just won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And I think he had just an incredible effect on the world. So, and he's 97 years old, the oldest ever to win, and he's still alive.
Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes. Anyone have a pertinent story to talk about frustrations with publishers or trying to get it published? Someone want to share anything? That just a couple of minutes. Okay, Kate.
When it comes to publishers, please read the contract. My collaborator and I had our friendship incredibly strained, and that's why the second edition of Mina Cortez is the second edition once the rights reverted, because he sold it to a publisher without me, even though the contract said you will not get a penny from anything sold on Amazon. So please read your contracts if you sign with a publisher. Thank you.
Reverend Barnhouse.
I've worked with a couple different publishers, and one of them came to me, but I had to go to the other ones. And some publishers just won't even talk to you unless you have an agent. So first you have to read the writer's, what is that thing called? Writer's Resource? Writer's Market. And it tells you all the agents and what kind of writings they handle. And if you send your writing to the wrong one, you won't ever hear back. And mostly you won't ever hear back anyway. And sometimes they'll write to you. I had one recently, this is in publishing time, recently, a year ago, say, I'll read it again if you tighten up the plot. And so I did and sent it. That was January. Really, my average is about 8 months before I hear back from agent. So you're always tempted to just go on and publish it yourself, which I did with one of my books. And then there are the editors, because for the radio audience, I'm making the crazy hair gesture. I'm a Southern writer, and my editor was from Massachusetts. And she wanted to correct, quote unquote, everything that I had written that was Southern, and I had to actually fight, which is way out of my comfort zone for a Southerner, because when I'm fighting, the people from Massachusetts don't notice. So she made me actually she made me let her actually put a little disclaimer. This book has been edited. because I got to keep some of the Southernisms. So it's heartbreaking. It takes a long time. It's totally not worth it if you're in it for the money. The average professional writer makes $4,000 a year from their writing. Some people are much luckier, and most of us do it just because we have to, not because of the money.
We wish to thank the 6 presenters today. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being here.